The earliest cities appeared around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq. These were the first of many river valley civilizations that would appear across the world, including the Nile, Indus, and Yellow River valleys. These new, complex societies led to more sophisticated urban life and bureaucracy. Thousands of people lived in these cities with no public transportation. Traffic must have been beastly. But cars weren't invented yet, so perhaps I'm joking. Class and gender distinctions arose. The need to account for ownership of resources led to the rise of written language, and therefore, real history, a history to which women were central. The establishment of hierarchies in some societies led to the erosion of equality and a downturn in women's status. Surplus allowed some people to generate hordes of excess food and other items. Class differences emerged where they hadn't been. Rank became normal and natural. Evidence of enslaved laborers was evident, and women, as well as their work, decreased in value. The status of women plummeted as a result of societies becoming more complex, leading to the rise of the patriarchal ideal, which regarded men as superior to women and sons preferable to daughters. Ew. Surplus grain led to the rise in property, and therefore property rights, which in most places was bestowed to men. And so women, therefore, became a version of property. Women, because of increased fertility, labored longer in domestic life, which eventually resulted in women's domesticity becoming the norm. Women were defined through their male relationships, and men regulated the social and sexual relations of women and their families. Then and before, gender and gender expression remained a significant part of how a person lived their lives. One historian explained,
"No division of human society has held greater significance for the lives of individuals as those of sex and gender."
Welcome to Remedial Herstory, where we ask what happened to the women and put them in. In this series, we tell women's history from era to era from the perspectives of differing and diverse women. Women are half of history. Welcome to Herstory. The city-states in Sumer, in the Middle East, emerged around 3500 BCE or before the Common Era. They are believed to be the first in world history. These cities would have had tens of thousands of residents each, and as such, they had a comprehensive system for managing property, trade, and exchange. Grain was hugely important in these early civilizations as it provided stable food sources and calories. There was no going against the grain here, I can tell you. Farmers paid taxes in grains, which were stored by priests in storehouses for use by royals, priests, and nobles, which possibly later became temples, known as ziggurats. Priests often managed and kept the grain reserves and recorded their ownership. Thus emerged the earliest writing. The world's first known and named priest was a woman, Inanna, who lived around 2300 BCE. Inanna authored the oldest living surviving religious text, a hymn honoring the Sumerian goddess Inanna. Throughout the Sumerian city-states, women were permitted to be priests, but it's likely only wealthy girls attended schools and therefore got the training needed to become a priest. Thus, class greatly impacted the differences in women's lives. People married to secure stable family units. Literature and poems from the time discuss romantic and loving relationships, but these would have been uncommon matches. Mesopotamian families were most interested in the family unit and its protection, so a wealthy and healthy match would have been pursued. In times of desperation, poor families would sometimes sell their daughters into slavery or prostitution, dehumanizing them. However, these roles looked slightly different than how we may think of them today. While this placed huge restrictions on people's individual liberty and autonomy, enslaved people were often regarded more as servants and were able to earn their freedom eventually. Prostitutes did not live the so degrading life often associated with it, but instead had means for an income and sometimes would serve a spiritual role in the temples. Some women engaged in trading, especially in weaving and selling cloth, perfumery, and making incense, and midwifery. Weaving and selling cloth produced immense wealth for Mesopotamia, and temples employed thousands of women in making cloth. Women owned and ran taverns, which gave them wealth and influence in their communities. They also helped with food production, brewing beer, and wine. The role that women played in this period is exemplified by the goddess Ninkasi, the patron of beer. A poem dating back to 2100 BCE praises her role.
Ninkasi, the expert who redounds to her mother's credit. Her fermenting vat is of green lapis lazuli. Her beer cask is of refined silver and of gold. If she stands by the beer, there is joy. If she sits by the beer, there is gladness. As cupbearer, she mixes the beer, never wearying as she walks back and forth. Ninkasi, the keg at her side, on her hips. May she make my beer serving perfect.
Kubaba was the first female monarch in recorded history, living between 2500 and 2330 BCE in Sumer. We know about her because she's on the Sumerian kings list, not queen's list, king's list, which means she ruled outright. She was not a consort. The list often blurs the line between historical fact and legend. It says, the woman tavern keeper who made firm the foundations of Kish. Thus, she rose to power after being a tavern keeper. Shows how powerful that role was. She was a bartender and perhaps hosts people in this place. She probably networked with hundreds of people in her tavern. But this is not a rags to riches story. A tavern keeper holds a lot of power, providing shelter, food, and building relationships. Cheers to that. Another source is a bit more detailed, but this is without a doubt a piece of propaganda from the time. And so this source says Kubaba feeds a fisherman and persuades him to offer his catch to a god to earn his favor. His response comes as no surprise. He entrusted to her, the tavern keeper, sovereignty over the whole world. So basically, her entire campaign to become ruler of the entire world, as Sumerians saw it, was to give a fish to some guy. Must have been some fish. She was said to have ruled for 100 years, which is obviously an exaggeration. She is believed to have fortified the city and made it very strong, and after her rule, kinship passed to her son and then later her grandson, creating a dynasty. Her epitaph is longer than most of the other kings on the list, showing that she was significant. Over time, it seems that the human woman that existed faded, and 1,000 years later, in the Hittite period, she eventually became a divine goddess-like being. Kubaba became the great mother of gods, and she still boasted a cult of worship as late as 3,000 years after her death. The prefix Ku means holy, so Holy Baba, or if one is surprised, Holy Baba! Has a nice ring to it. The oldest story in the world was written in ancient Mesopotamia between 2900 BCE and 2350 BCE. It is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tale itself discusses the role of women in civilizing men, especially the central figure Shamhat, a temple prostitute. Based on the necessity of this show, the women of Gilgamesh never quite finished their job. The king, Gilgamesh, represents settled life and civilization, as he comes from the walled city and battles with a beast man named Enkidu to prove his superiority. The beast man, who is hairy, unwashed, runs with the beasts of the wild, and has never had bread or beer, the symbols of civilization, comes to King Gilgamesh's city of Uruk. Shamhat, the temple prostitute, tames him and brings him to the shepherds, where he learns how to domesticate beasts. He eats bread, drinks beer, washes, puts on clothes, and falls in love. In other words, the foundation myth of the first civilization is a story of a woman taming a man. After being tamed, he battles with King Gilgamesh on the walls of the city Uruk itself, which is symbolic. The two become friends and decide to go on a lot of cool adventures together. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells tales of their heroism and adventures, their battles and encounters with supernatural beings. The two heroes are often troubled by or assisted by jealous and helpful gods, including the goddess Ishtar. We discussed her in episode 2, Mother Earth and the Great Goddesses. The first legal codes were recorded almost a millennium later in 1800 BCE under King Hammurabi of Assyria. The code was carved into stones throughout the empire, visible to all. He likely didn't invent these laws, but rather recorded common practices from the region. For women, these laws offered some protections, but also codified their subordination. Most of the laws were about crimes and relationships and followed a if-then pattern, providing a clear, just consequence. From him, we get the whole an eye for an eye idea. But no, this was not an early system of trade. These laws showed us a lot about how class impacted women's lives. So, for example, if a man killed a pregnant maidservant, he was punished with a monetary fine. But if he killed a freeborn pregnant woman, his own daughter would be killed in retribution. If a baby died in a nursemaid's care, she would have her breasts cut off. Respectable women were those under the control of one man, who veiled themselves and rarely went outside. Disreputable women, such as slaves and prostitutes, were forbidden to wear veils as a symbol of their inferior status. Thus, veiling became a status symbol between women. Yes, the runways were full of the latest veils that season. According to laws 137 to 143, women who neglected their husbands would be thrown into the water and drowned. Men who did the same would only have to pay back the dowry if, and only if, she had produced children. Nice. Men had extramarital relationships with maidservants and slaves, but women who did that were drowned. Drowning seems to be a common theme throughout Hammurabi's code. Even in situations where both men and women were at fault, women's sexuality was heavily regulated. Women accused of adultery, with or without evidence, had to prove their innocence in dangerous rituals. Some laws show concern about abandoned women and children during wartime, but still, it was rough. The Nile River Valley seems to have been somewhat less patriarchal than its neighbor. Women had similar legal status and rights as men. They were able to divorce, run businesses, but social pressure may have prevented them from exercising those rights. Women and men are often depicted in art in loving embraces that appear mutual. Mesopotamian and Egyptian rulers engaged in diplomacy, and so from those conversations we can tell a lot about women's lives. Mesopotamian rulers were accustomed to marrying their daughters off to establish peace between states, but Egyptian found this oppressive. One Egyptian diplomat wrote, From
ancient times, the daughter of the king of Egypt has not been given to anyone.
Egyptian women were even known to be pharaohs, which allows us to know a few specific women. Mernith was a queen consort and regent that lived around 2970 BCE. She may have ruled in her own right for a period of time, as her tomb is similar to other Egyptian kings, without a large underground chamber, graves for servants, sacrificial offerings, and a solar boat. Her name is also included on a list of pharaohs with the title King's Mother. If she truly ruled in her own right, Mernith would replace Kubaba as the first in recorded history. Nefertiti is considered one of the most mysterious and powerful women in ancient Egypt, ruling from 1353 to 1336 BCE. She came to power as a favored consort of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Eventually, she became his wife and is depicted alongside her husband with an unprecedented frequency. She gave birth to 6 daughters. That's a lot of babies, but yes, 6 daughters. And so her husband started taking on other wives to try to get a male heir, including his own sister. Ew. Yes, the ancient Egyptians made great advances in science, but certainly not when it comes to genetics. Eventually, they made a politically problematic move to replace Egypt's polytheistic faith in many gods with a form of monotheism, worshiping only the sun god called Aten. This caused such an uproar that they had to move the entire capital in order to secure their power. From there, Nefertiti is pretty much wiped from the historic record. So some people think that she died, but it's also possible that she ruled outright under a different name. Interestingly, no one has found her burial place, which is unusual for a queen of her status. Her husband fathered the future King Tut. Tut owes his fame to the stunning treasures that were buried with him and recently discovered. But Tut died in his teens. So one theory is that the elaborate tomb that we've seen, which certainly could not have been built in time for his premature death as a teenager, was actually built for Nefertiti. In his chamber with him, there are pictures that look like her. So maybe that's where the powerful Queen of Egypt rests. Is this the world's first case of identity theft or grave theft? Finally, Hatshepsut reigned between 1478 and 1458 BCE. She became Queen of Egypt after marrying her half-brother at the age of 12. Then, she became regent to her infant stepson, Thutmose III, when her husband died. Eventually, Hatshepsut assumed the title and full powers of pharaoh. She demanded to be portrayed with art with all the symbols of a pharaoh, sometimes including a fake beard. Hatshepsut was laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings, fake beard and all. Later, kings tried to remove her from history, but clearly they failed. A clear win for Herstory. Although the river valleys of Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile rivers were the first places where city-states emerged, they were certainly not the only ones. Human migrations from 30,000 BCE meant that humans occupied most of the globe and had made their way across Asia to modern-day Americas. From nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes to sedentary permanent settlements, human civilizations flourished all over the world, paving the way for, paving, among other things. Around 2100 to 1600 BCE, tribal groups consolidated to form more permanent city-states in the Yellow River Valley of China, creating the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty. It is likely that this consolidation occurred because of the need to solve the problem of the dangerous floods and overflow from the Yellow River that would regularly wipe out villages and crops. The mythological Yu the Great was credited with controlling the waters. But in all of world history, we have to ask, how were these pivotal turning points for women? Consolidation meant a rise in patriarchal control, more authoritarian practices, and a dramatic decline in women's status in the Yellow River Valley. Some cultures along the Yellow River had been egalitarian and matrilineal, but they rapidly disappeared because of violence and social upheaval. Ancient Chinese culture began the first steps towards a rigid ranking system that pushed women towards the bottom. Chinese women adhered to a philosophy called the three obediences. Be obedient to your father before marriage, your husband after marriage, and your son when your husband dies. Never mind the fact that she had literally created that man from her own body. Women had arranged marriages, were sometimes sold into slavery by their own fathers. Annually, a woman was plumped up and sent down the Yellow River as a sacrifice to the gods. Horrifying. That said, out of this early dynasty came a popular folk tale about a wise woman named Laonu. The children of the town came running to her, claiming that the sky was falling. She smiled as the town began preparing for the spring festival where young teenagers met to find their spouses. She patched the sky with the stars, just one of the women holding up the sky for people over the ages. In South Asia, complex societies began in the Indus River Valley. While archaeology does provide powerful insights to their culture, little is known about this early city-state because no surviving readable language exists. Most of what is known comes from Hindu oral traditions and archaeological evidence. Perhaps surpassing their prehistoric counterparts around the world, Indian women enjoyed a comparatively high status during the early Vedic period. Evidence of female clay figurines highlight the social, cultural role that women played in that society. The hairstyles, ornaments, and dress clearly indicate the prominence assigned to women at that time in what appeared to be a nearly egalitarian society. Bronze figurines of a dancing girl led scholars to think women had a variety of activities outside domestic responsibilities, including getting down with their good selves. Although society was patriarchal and had a strict caste system, the abundance of female goddesses and the existence of a female warrior class shows that women were regarded with high status and respect. There was a prayer for a scholarly daughter and admiring texts for female academics. Vedic texts reveal that women were honored and empowered both in traditional domestic spaces as well as in public spaces traditionally dominated by men. Across the world, women's lives in River Valley civilizations were changing rapidly as societies settled and developed more sophisticated systems that often pushed women into subordinate status. By the end of this era, so much remained in question. What would happen to women as societies continued to become more complex? how would the influence of empires and monotheistic faiths impact the lives of women? Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into these questions and form your own conclusions, go to our website, remedialherstory.com, where you can find free, ready-made lesson plans, primary documents, recommended films and reading,